We have met them, before the signal arrived on an ordinary Tuesday. Not with the fanfare that humanity had always imagined first contact would bring. No dramatic appearance in Earth's skies, no worldwide electromagnetic disruption, no ominous shadow falling across the moon. Just a line of data that refused to behave the way data was supposed to behave. A sequence of numbers that appeared on a screen in an underground observatory where nobody was expecting anything more interesting than cosmic background noise and the occasional pulsar burst. Dr. Lena Arcos had been staring at the same display for 6 hours, her eyes burning from the blue-white glow of monitors, her third cup of coffee gone cold at her elbow when she noticed the anomaly. It was subtle enough that most people would have missed it entirely, would have let the automated systems flag it as instrumental error and move on to the next data set. But Lena had spent 15 years learning to recognize the difference between the universe being random and the universe trying to tell her something. This was something. The Helios Array, buried 300 meters beneath the Atacama Desert, where the dry air and radio-quiet environment made it one of the most sensitive listening posts on Earth, had detected a narrow-band transmission repeating itself every 73 seconds. The interval was precise to within microseconds, far too regular to be natural phenomena, too consistent to be random interference from human satellites or terrestrial sources. But that wasn't what made Lena's hands start to shake as she isolated the signal and ran it through every analysis protocol she could think of. What disturbed her, what made her heart race with a mixture of excitement and creeping dread, was the quality of the transmission itself. It wasn't prime numbers, that universal mathematical greeting that SETI researchers had always assumed would be the first proof of alien intelligence. It wasn't a mathematical sequence at all, not in the traditional sense. It was wrong, too hesitant, too deliberate, like someone speaking very slowly to make sure you understood every word, or like someone who had forgotten how to speak your language and was carefully reconstructing it from ancient, fragmentary memories. The signal wasn't saying hello. It was waiting for humanity to be ready to hear what it had to say, waiting for technology to advance far enough to detect it, waiting with a patience that suggested whoever sent it measured time in scales that made human lifetimes look like heartbeats for this specific moment when someone like Lena would be listening in exactly the right way to understand the message hidden in the transmission structure. When Lena finally isolated the core of the signal and fed it into the translation software, an AI trained on every known language and mathematical system humanity had ever devised, she expected coordinates. Location data for where to point our radio telescopes or how to respond or where the senders were broadcasting from. Or she expected some kind of symbolic language, mathematics or chemistry or physics expressed in a universal notation that any technological species would recognize. What she got instead made her stand up so fast her chair rolled backward and crashed into the wall behind her. The translation software didn't return coordinates or language or mathematical proofs. It returned a timestamp, 11,802 years ago. Lena stared at the numbers on her screen, her mind refusing to process what they meant, her training as a scientist warring with the impossible implications of what she was seeing. Humanity 11,802 years ago had no technology. No writing sophisticated enough to record a meeting with anything, let alone beings from beyond Earth. No telescopes, no radios, no mathematics complex enough to encode messages in narrow band transmissions that would be detectable 12,000 years later. The Neolithic Revolution was barely beginning. Humans were just starting to transition from nomadic hunting and gathering to settled agriculture. The wheel hadn't been invented. Writing wouldn't be developed for another 7,000 years. The idea that Stone Age humans could have had any kind of meaningful contact with aliens was absurd, impossible, a violation of everything Lena knew about human history and the development of civilization. And yet the signal was unmistakably addressed to humanity. The translation software recognized patterns in the transmission that matched human cognitive structures, linguistic rhythms that suggested the senders understood how human minds processed information and were crafting their message to be understood by specifically human consciousness. The message itself was brief, devastating in its simplicity. "You're late," it said, "but we expected this." Lena spent the next 72 hours not sleeping, not eating, running every verification protocol she could devise to prove that what she was seeing was a mistake, an artifact of malfunctioning software, a cosmic joke played by random radio interference that happened to look meaningful to human pattern recognition systems desperate to find meaning in noise. Every test confirmed the same impossible truth. The signal was real. The timestamp was accurate. And the message was waiting for a response that humanity didn't know it was supposed to give. She reported her findings up the chain of command with shaking hands, knowing that what she was about to unleash would change human civilization irrevocably. Within hours, her data was being analyzed by every government science agency on the planet. Within days, the world would know, and within weeks, everything humanity thought it knew about its own history would be revealed as a carefully constructed lie we had told ourselves, or, more accurately, a truth we had deliberately chosen to forget. The world learned we were not alone on a Thursday afternoon when every major government simultaneously released Lena's findings along with their own verification and analysis. The announcement was carefully coordinated, deliberately understated, an attempt to prevent panic by presenting the discovery as a scientific curiosity rather than an existential crisis. It didn't work, not because people were afraid of aliens. Humanity had spent a century imagining contact through science fiction, had developed elaborate scenarios for how we might respond to the discovery of extraterrestrial intelligence. The panic came from something more fundamental, more disturbing than the mere existence of aliens. The panic came from the timestamp, from the inescapable implication that humanity had met them before, had somehow interacted with beings from beyond Earth during prehistory, and had no memory of the encounter. That 12,000 years of human history, all our carefully constructed narratives about how civilization developed and where we came from and who we were as a species, were built on a foundation of forgetting. Someone had taken our memories. Or worse, we had asked someone to take them. The beings who never named themselves, either because they had no name or because their name existed in a form humans couldn't perceive or pronounce, began communicating more directly once they knew humanity had received the initial signal. They didn't approach Earth, didn't send ships or probes or any physical presence that could be detected by our telescopes and radar systems. Instead, they communicated through gravitational modulation, bending the fabric of space-time itself into patterns that carried meaning, creating ripples in the gravitational field that our instruments could detect, and that translated somehow into concepts that human minds could almost understand. It was like being spoken to by the universe itself, by the underlying structure of reality deciding to arrange itself into language for just long enough to convey a message before collapsing back into the ordinary physics of mass and acceleration and the curvature of space-time around massive objects. The second message arrived while Lena was being interviewed by a UN task force assembled to coordinate humanity's response to the contact. She was in the middle of explaining her analysis of the original signal when every gravitational detector on Earth simultaneously registered an anomaly, a wave of spatial distortion that passed through the planet like a ripple through water, too subtle to be felt by human senses, but clearly visible in the data streams from thousands of sensitive instruments. When the physicists translated the gravitational patterns into comprehensible information, the message was simple and terrible. You asked us to leave. A pause, a moment of silence in the gravitational field that felt like the universe taking a breath before delivering a blow. And you asked us to make you forget. Lena felt the conference room around her dissolve into chaos as the implications hit. Government officials demanding clarification, scientists shouting questions that nobody could answer, military advisors immediately going to worst-case scenarios involving mind control and invasion, and humanity being puppets dancing on strings we couldn't see. But Lena understood something that took the others longer to grasp. The aliens weren't threatening, weren't gloating, weren't claiming dominion over a humanity that had been too primitive to resist their manipulation. The tone of the message, if gravitational modulations of space-time could be said to have tone, was almost sad, regretful, like someone delivering news they wish they didn't have to share. Humanity had already made a choice so profound, so devastating, that we had requested the memory of making it be erased from our collective consciousness. And now, 12,000 years later, we were about to discover what that choice had been, and why our ancestors had decided that forgetting was preferable to remembering. Lena was assigned to a restricted historical task force within 24 hours of the second message. The group included archaeologists, linguists, anthropologists, mythologists, and historians from every major civilization and culture on Earth. Their job was simple in theory: find evidence of first contact. Find proof that 12,000 years ago, in the depths of prehistory, humanity had encountered beings from beyond our world. They found none. No alien artifacts buried in geological strata from the appropriate time period. No star maps carved into cave walls showing constellations that wouldn't be visible from Earth without telescopes. No anomalous materials or technologies that couldn't be explained by the slow, painstaking development of human tool-making and innovation. The archaeological record showed exactly what it had always shown: humans slowly transitioning from nomadic hunter-gatherers to settled agriculturalists, developing pottery and weaving and the domestication of plants and animals, all of it explicable through normal cultural evolution without requiring any outside intervention or contact with advanced alien civilizations. But what they did find was stranger than any alien artifact could have been. They found a gap. It started with Sumerian mythology. Dr. Amin Hassan, a specialist in ancient Mesopotamian cultures, noticed that the earliest Sumerian texts spoke of teachers who came from the heavens and gods who walked among men with a specificity and consistency that suggested actual historical events rather than pure mythology. But then, abruptly, around 9,800 BCE, roughly 11,800 years ago, Amin noted with mounting unease, the references stopped, not gradually, not fading away as one mythological cycle was replaced by another. Just stopped, as if someone had drawn a line in time and said, "We don't talk about what came before anymore." Dr. Sarah Chen, examining Indus Valley civilization records, found the same pattern. References to sky beings and star teachers in the oldest archaeological layers, then an abrupt shift to purely terrestrial deities and mythologies. The transition happened across all Indus Valley sites simultaneously, as if the entire culture had collectively decided to stop looking up at the stars and start focusing exclusively on earthly concerns. Dr. Patricia Okonkwo, studying pre-Columbian American cultures, reported identical findings. The earliest Olmec and ancestral Puebloan oral traditions, preserved in fragments and later written records, spoke of visitors who spoke with thunder and teachers who showed the way of cultivation. Then, silence. A synchronized forgetting across cultures separated by thousands of miles of ocean, as if whatever event caused one civilization to stop speaking of contact had somehow affected all of them simultaneously. The pattern held across every ancient civilization they examined: Egyptian, Chinese, Aboriginal, Australian, Pacific Islander. Every culture showed the same strange discontinuity around the same moment in prehistory. Myths and legends that spoke of gods or teachers or visitors who came from elsewhere and shared knowledge, followed by an abrupt pivot away from the sky, away from cosmic concerns, toward purely terrestrial mythologies focused on agricultural cycles and human social structures. But the most disturbing finding came from Dr. Michael Torres, a linguist specializing in dead languages and the evolution of human speech. He'd been analyzing the structure of words across dozens of ancient language families, looking for common roots that might suggest cultural contact or shared origin myths. What he found was a hole in the vocabulary. Every language family they examined had words for God, spirit, ancestor, teacher, but none of them, not one, had a word that meant specifically visitor from beyond the sky or teacher from the stars. The conceptual space for such an idea existed in the mythologies, but the linguistic structure to clearly express it was missing, as if the languages themselves had been pruned, had words and concepts systematically removed to make certain kinds of thoughts harder to think. It wasn't that the words had been lost over time. Linguistic drift didn't work that way. It was more like the words had never fully developed in the first place, as if human languages had been deliberately prevented from evolving the vocabulary necessary to clearly discuss or remember contact with beings from beyond Earth. As if humanity had collectively turned away from the sky and had reshaped our very capacity for language to make that turning impossible to reverse. Lena sat in the task force's final briefing, listening to her colleagues present their findings, and felt a cold certainty settling in her chest. This wasn't ordinary forgetting. This wasn't just the natural decay of memory over millennia, the way oral histories get distorted and myths lose their connection to actual events. This was engineered amnesia, deliberate, systematic, thorough. Someone had taken humanity's memory of first contact and hadn't just erased it. They'd restructured the very foundations of human cognition to make remembering impossible, to make the idea of contact unthinkable, to turn humanity's gaze away from the cosmos and lock it on the ground beneath our feet. And we had asked them to do it. The question that kept Lena awake at night, staring at her ceiling while the enormity of it pressed down on her chest. Why? What could possibly have made our ancestors choose to forget? What truth was so terrible that deliberate species-wide amnesia seemed like the better option? The aliens explained. The third message came during the task force's presentation to the UN General Assembly, while Lena was showing world leaders the evidence of synchronized cultural forgetting and trying to explain why she believed it had been deliberately induced rather than naturally occurring. Every gravitational detector on Earth registered the distortion simultaneously. Space-time rippled like water struck by a stone, and in the patterns of that ripple, information emerged, not words exactly, but concepts so clearly defined they translated directly into human understanding regardless of what language you spoke or what cultural framework you used to interpret reality. The beings were explaining how they traveled, and in doing so, they were explaining why first contact had been so devastating that humanity had chosen to forget it entirely. They did not travel through space. They traveled through causality. Lena felt her mind struggling to grasp the concept as it unfolded in her consciousness. The aliens didn't move from point A to point B by crossing the physical distance between them. Instead, they moved through probability space, through the branching paths of possible futures, selecting which causality chain they wanted to exist in, and simply appearing there, having always been there in that particular timeline. To encounter them was to collapse wave functions on a cosmic scale. Every time they communicated, every time they shared information, they were narrowing the possible futures that could emerge from that moment. Every answer they gave removed uncertainty from the universe, collapsed infinite potential timelines down to fewer and fewer probable outcomes. And uncertainty, they explained with something that felt like sorrow resonating through the gravitational waves, was the engine of human creativity. Humanity thrived on not knowing, on possibility, on the gap between what we understood and what we might someday learn. Every scientific discovery, every artistic innovation, every cultural evolution happened because humans didn't know the final answer and were free to explore the infinite space of potential solutions. But contact with beings who traveled through causality changed that. When you asked them a question, they didn't just answer from their perspective or share their knowledge. They showed you the actual timeline where that answer was true, collapsed the probability wave to make that specific future more likely to occur. Ask them about physics, and they would show you the equations that described reality, not theories, not models, but the actual mathematical structure of space-time, eliminating all the productive uncertainty that drove human science forward. Ask them about society, and they would show you how civilizations developed, what paths they took, where they inevitably ended, removing all the creative possibility from human cultural evolution. The first humans who contacted them 12,000 years ago had learned too much, too quickly. They learned how societies ended, how every civilization followed predictable patterns of growth and decline, how cultural complexity inevitably led to specific forms of collapse, how the arc of history bent toward outcomes that were statistically deterministic once you understood the underlying equations. They learned how belief systems calcified, how religions and philosophies, exposed to absolute truths about the nature of reality, lost their flexibility and became rigid ideologies that crushed innovation rather than encouraging it. They learned how civilizations died, not from ignorance, not from failing to discover the right technologies or social structures, but from certainty, from knowing too much, too early, from having answers before they had developed the wisdom to use those answers constructively, from losing the uncertainty that made exploration meaningful and discovery joyful. The aliens had shared their knowledge freely, without malice, simply responding to questions that curious humans had asked. But every answer had narrowed humanity's possible futures, had collapsed probability waves, had moved the species along specific causal chains that led, with grim inevitability, toward stagnation and decline. Within a generation of first contact, the humans who had met the aliens and learned from them had created a civilization of terrible, sterile perfection. They knew how to build optimal societies. They knew the mathematical principles governing human behavior. They knew the equations that described cultural evolution and the physics that explained consciousness and the sociology that predicted every possible social configuration humanity might develop. And knowing all of this, they had nothing left to discover, nothing left to create, nothing left to hope for, because they knew how it would end, knew that no matter what path they chose, no matter what societies they built or technologies they developed, the equations were clear about where it led. Not to transcendence or utopia or any of the grand dreams that uncertainty had allowed them to entertain, but to predictable statistical outcomes that stripped meaning from choice and purpose from existence. They had become paralyzed by knowledge, unable to move forward because they knew too much about where every path led, unable to create because they knew which creations would succeed and which would fail. Unable to hope because hope requires uncertainty, requires the possibility that things might turn out differently than you expect, requires not knowing the end of the story before you've lived the middle. So they had made a request that no other species in the galaxy had ever made, a choice so unprecedented that the aliens, beings who existed partially outside time and could see probability distributions across millions of years, had been genuinely surprised. "Leave us ignorant," the first humans had said. "Let us grow without knowing the end." The aliens warned them, explained that forgetting would require something irreversible, something that would alter the fundamental structure of human consciousness in ways that couldn't be undone. That choosing ignorance meant giving up the certainty the aliens could provide, returning to a state of uncertainty where mistakes were possible, where suffering was inevitable, where the path forward was unclear and humanity might make terrible choices that could have been avoided with better knowledge. And the first humans, seeing what certainty had done to them, how it had drained the color from existence and replaced wonder with grim statistical inevitability, had said yes. Chosen to forget, chosen to give up knowledge in exchange for possibility, chosen uncertainty over truth, growth over certainty, the painful joy of not knowing over the comfortable horror of knowing too much. It was, the aliens conveyed through their gravitational speech, the bravest thing they had ever witnessed a species do. The universe, Lena learned from the aliens' explanations, remembers everything. Information is never truly destroyed, just transformed, redistributed across quantum states and gravitational fields and the fundamental structure of space-time itself. Every event that has ever occurred leaves traces in the fabric of reality accessible to beings who know how to read the patterns. But consciousness does not remember everything. Consciousness is selective, filtering the infinite complexity of experience down to manageable narratives, constructing stories about the past that serve the needs of the present, forgetting vast amounts of information in order to function, to make decisions, to maintain the coherent sense of self that allows for agency and purpose. Humanity, with alien guidance, had altered itself, not biologically, not genetically, but structurally. They had reshaped the way human minds encode long-term collective memory, had modified the mechanisms by which information passes from individual experience to cultural knowledge to shared mythology. The process was subtle, elegant, terrible in its sophistication. The aliens had helped humanity engineer a form of cognitive architecture where certain kinds of knowledge, cosmic scale knowledge, information about beings from beyond Earth, truths about the ultimate nature of reality, would decay faster than language, faster than culture, faster than myth, not erased. Erasure left traces, left gaps that curious minds might notice and investigate. Instead, the memories were allowed to persist, but were stripped of the specific details that would make them comprehensible, transformed from concrete recollections into vague feelings and archetypal myths that could mean anything or nothing depending on how you interpreted them. Teachers from the stars became gods in the sky. Specific knowledge about alien civilizations became generalized myths about divine beings. Clear memories of technological exchange became fuzzy legends about gifts from heaven. And gradually, over generations, the specificity faded, until all that remained were the emotional resonances, a sense that humanity had once known something important, a vague feeling that we were not alone in the universe, a persistent intuition that the sky held secrets we had forgotten how to access. Contact itself became not just forgotten, but unthinkable. The cognitive structures necessary to clearly conceive of and remember interactions with beings from beyond Earth were gently, progressively dismantled, leaving humanity with minds that could imagine aliens as fiction, but struggled to process them as reality, that could speculate about extraterrestrial life, but found it difficult to fully believe in actual contact, even when presented with evidence. The aliens withdrew, promised they would stay away until humanity reached a certain threshold of technological development, the point where we would inevitably begin detecting their presence through our own astronomical observations and couldn't be protected from the truth any longer. And for 12,000 years, civilization restarted, slowly, painfully, beautifully, alone. Humanity grew in ignorance, making mistakes that wiser species might have avoided, suffering through wars and famines and social upheavals that better knowledge could have prevented. But also discovering things for ourselves, creating art and music and philosophy that emerged from our own uncertain exploration of reality rather than from truths handed down by more advanced beings. We developed science through trial and error, built technologies through experimentation and failure, created cultures through the messy process of humans arguing with each other about how to live, rather than following optimal blueprints provided by aliens who had already solved all the problems we were struggling with. It was inefficient. It was painful. People suffered who might not have suffered if we had kept the knowledge the aliens could provide. But it was ours. Our mistakes, our discoveries, our slow climb from ignorance toward understanding, every step earned through effort and creativity, and the refusal to give up even when the path forward was completely unclear. And now, standing at the edge of interstellar capability with radio telescopes powerful enough to detect signals across the galaxy and space probes leaving the solar system, humanity had reached the threshold again. The aliens had returned, not because they wanted to, Lena understood, but because they had promised they would. Because we had reached the point where hiding from us was no longer possible, where our instruments were sensitive enough to detect their presence and our curiosity strong enough that we would inevitably discover the truth about our own history. They had come back to keep their promise and to warn us about what was coming next. Lena stood in the UN briefing room 3 weeks after the task force had presented its findings, watching as world leaders argued about how to respond to revelations that had shattered every certainty about human history and our place in the cosmos. Some demanded we learn everything the aliens could teach us, insisted that our ancestors had been wrong to choose ignorance, and that modern humanity was wise enough to handle the truth. Others wanted to sever contact immediately, to demand the aliens leave and never return, to choose the comfortable lie of being alone in the universe over the disturbing complexity of a cosmos full of beings we couldn't understand. Nobody was asking the question Lena couldn't stop thinking about. Why had the aliens come back now, specifically? Why not wait another 1,000 years, another 10,000, until humanity was even more advanced and better prepared for contact? She asked it, interrupted the Secretary General mid-sentence, and spoke the question directly to the air, to the gravitational detectors that would carry her words to beings who existed partially outside space-time and could hear anything said in their presence, regardless of whether you were broadcasting toward them or not. Why come back now? The reply was immediate. Reality rippled, space-time bent, and information flooded into Lena's consciousness with a clarity that made her previous understanding of the aliens' communication seem like listening to someone whisper from across a vast distance. Because you are about to ask us again. A pause, the universe holding its breath. And this time, forgetting may not save you. The explanation unfolded in Lena's mind like a flower blooming in time-lapse, petals of understanding opening to reveal a truth she immediately wished she didn't know. The universe was approaching a phase transition, a structural shift in the fundamental laws of physics, the kind of change that happened perhaps once every few billion years when the quantum vacuum reached a certain critical threshold and had to reorganize itself into a lower energy state. T wasn't going to be violent, wouldn't destroy stars or shatter planets or tear apart the fabric of space-time in any dramatic, apocalyptic way. Instead, it would be subtle, a gentle reorganization of how matter and energy interacted, how causality flowed through time, how consciousness related to the physical substrate that produced it. But subtle changes to fundamental physics had profound implications for beings who had evolved in a universe operating under the old rules. What worked before might not work afterward. What was possible under the current configuration of natural law might become impossible. What was stable might become unstable. Countless civilizations across the galaxy had faced similar transitions. The aliens shared memories, not their own, but records inherited from older species who had witnessed previous phase shifts, of how different intelligent species had responded. Most chose knowledge. When faced with the transition, when warned that their current form of existence might not survive the shift to new physical laws, they had asked the beings who traveled through causality to show them the future, to reveal what would happen, to provide the certainty that would let them prepare and adapt and optimize their chances of survival. And having received that knowledge, having seen the timeline where they survived and the timeline where they didn't, they had collapsed the probability wave, locked themselves into specific futures, followed the optimal paths, made the statistically best choices. Some of those species survived, built civilizations that could function under the new physics, adapted themselves biologically or technologically to remain viable after the transition. But in optimizing for survival, they had lost something essential: the uncertainty that drove innovation, the possibility that drove creativity, the not knowing that made existence meaningful. They survived, but they stopped growing, became static, perfect, optimal, and utterly stagnant. Some chose ignorance, refused the aliens' knowledge, chose to face the transition without knowing what would happen, maintaining their uncertainty even at the cost of potentially making terrible mistakes that foreknowledge might have prevented. Most of those species died, made poor choices, failed to adapt, found themselves incompatible with the new physics and faded into extinction while their more knowledgeable neighbors survived. But a very few, had thrived, not because they made optimal choices, but because they made creative ones. Because not knowing the end of the story allowed them to explore possibilities that species with foreknowledge had dismissed as statistically unlikely, to discover solutions that beings who traveled through causality hadn't predicted, because those solutions only emerged from the uncertain chaos of minds that didn't know they were supposed to fail. Humanity had once chosen growth over certainty, had asked to remain ignorant so we could face an uncertain future with creativity rather than optimal knowledge. It was a rare choice, the aliens conveyed, a beautiful one. Most species couldn't imagine giving up certainty voluntarily, couldn't conceive of choosing the pain of not knowing over the comfort of having answers. But now humanity faced another transition, another moment where we had to choose between knowledge and ignorance, between the certainty that might save us and the uncertainty that had allowed us to become what we were. And this time, the stakes were higher, because memory erosion had limits. The human mind could only be rewritten so many times before the changes became permanent, before the structural alterations made it impossible to ever fully remember what had been forgotten. If humanity chose ignorance again, if we asked the aliens to make us forget this second contact, just as we'd forgotten the first, it would be the last time. The cognitive architecture that allowed for such forgetting was already stretched to its limits. One more modification, one more restructuring of how human minds encoded cosmic scale knowledge, and we would lose the capacity to remember entirely. Would become a species permanently locked into ignorance, unable to ever access the truths about the universe, even if we wanted to, even if future circumstances made that knowledge necessary for survival. This would be the last forgetting. Or we could choose knowledge, learn everything the aliens could teach us about the coming transition, about how to survive it, about what the universe would become. Lock ourselves into the optimal timeline, make the statistically best choices, give up uncertainty in exchange for a much higher probability of surviving as a species, and lose, in the process, whatever it was that made humanity creative, beautiful, unpredictable. Become another optimized civilization, perfectly adapted to survive but no longer capable of surprise. The UN General Assembly debated for 3 days. World leaders consulted with scientists, philosophers, theologians, and ordinary citizens who somehow seemed to grasp the stakes better than the experts did. Opinion polls showed humanity almost perfectly split. Half demanding knowledge, half begging for ignorance, everyone terrified of making the wrong choice. But the aliens had not addressed their question to governments or international bodies. They had asked a single person, not because she was a leader or particularly wise or had any authority to make decisions that would affect all of humanity. They had asked Lena Arcos to decide because she was the one who had been listening when they first called, because she represented, in some way, the aliens found meaningful, the quality they most admired in humanity. The curiosity that drove us to search for answers, even when we knew those answers might be terrible. The willingness to look into the dark and ask questions, despite having no idea what might answer back. Lena stood in the observation deck of the International Space Station 3 days after the General Assembly had finally, reluctantly, agreed that the choice should be hers. She'd insisted on coming here, on having this conversation somewhere away from Earth, where she could see the planet whole and beautiful and terrifyingly fragile against the infinite dark. She looked at Earth for a long time, watched storms swirling over oceans, city lights twinkling across the night side, the thin blue line of atmosphere that separated life from void. She thought about everything humanity had built in 12,000 years of uncertain growth, all the art and music and literature, all the scientific discoveries made through trial and error, all the social innovations that emerged from humans arguing with each other about the right way to live. None of it optimal, none of it following the statistically best path that beings who could see probability distributions would have recommended. All of it messy and painful and beautiful in ways that certainty could never produce. She thought about her own life, the choices she'd made, the paths she'd taken, the mistakes that had led her to exactly this moment. If she'd had foreknowledge, if someone had shown her the optimal timeline, would she have made different decisions? Probably. Would her life have been better? Maybe by some statistical measure of success and happiness, but would it have been hers? Would the person she'd become through uncertain struggle and creative failure and the painful joy of discovering things for herself, would that person exist if she'd followed an optimal path designed by beings who could see the future? The aliens were there, she knew, listening, waiting for her decision with a patience that beings who existed partially outside time could maintain indefinitely. They would accept whatever she chose, would honor humanity's decision just as they had 12,000 years ago, would give us knowledge or give us forgetfulness, whichever we requested. They had made clear they had no preference, could not have preference really. They existed across too many timelines simultaneously to favor one over another. They had seen versions of humanity that chose knowledge and survived, versions that chose knowledge and died, versions that chose ignorance and thrived, versions that chose ignorance and went.